Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. Chinese have been doing one thing, not the Chinese, let me rewind. The CCP has been doing one thing very well across the world, and that is deceiving. That is lying, and that is actually making things to their advantage and trying to take advantage of, I won't call innocent nations, but in a sense so. From Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, the story has been deception. They've used one enemy against the other, one so called friend against the other. What is the story behind this whole deception and how have they fooled the world is something that we need to understand. And for that, for the second time on Dev Talks, I have with me someone I really enjoyed listening to last time with the hint of history and philosophy, because that's the real China. Dr. Geeta Kochhar. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining me once again.
Jai Hind to all your viewers, and thank you very much for inviting me to your channel. It's always a pleasure to join you and listen to many of your videos as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, as I said, chori hoti hai. There's one thing called theft and there's one thing called lies. China seems to have crossed the line in both of them. And right, not from now, right from the beginning, the intentions of the Chinese leadership with regards the hegemon, as they call it, the world hegemon, the Ba of the world, have been clear right from the beginning, but nobody picked it up. Why?
See, I mean, China is a very complex state. I mean, starting from what it was earlier and what it is today, it has moved, enormous paths, like a lot of changes and dramatic changes. The world finds this very tough to understand. And so, in order to really understand China, we really need to understand its history of China's foreign policy, especially how it is dealing with other countries. Then, what happened after Mao, that is the Deng Xiaoping period, that is post reform that we say, or after Deng Xiaoping came to power, how that changed. That is another phase of it, and I'm broadly putting these phases. And then, what is happening today? I mean, many say that it is a reversal of Xi Jinping is going back to Mao's time, or even there is a collision between what happened during Mao and what happened between Tang, something like that. So that is broadly these three things that you need to understand, and we can discuss that in elaboration. And lastly, about you know where the other countries, especially the Western powers, the US and other countries, really failed to understand China. What was wrong in terms of not just the political understanding, but other understanding, where it went wrong, where they lacked, and why China has become today what China has become today. Was it all planned, or what was it a step by step development, you know, towards how it is? Or culturally, also, you really need to look at China about historically what has been China. I mean, it has fought so many wars. It was always, wars and wars and wars in China. So, how that has been the history of China, which has really developed this whole civilization that we talk about. I mean, civilizations are meant according to what they had been in the past, in their history. That resonance is always there. So that is also crucial to understand. So we'll discuss all of that in today's discussion and see how it progresses.
And thank you for that introduction. Let's begin with Mao, who
Yes.
carried this little red book uh,
Hmm.
talking about the warring periods and the lessons from the warring periods and stuff like that. He carried this little red book, as they call it, which mentioned everything. And the Chinese literature has basically spoken about what China needs to do uh, as to become dominant in the world. Uh,
Hmm.
they've written books about it, and funnily speaking, that they follow these books. So Sun Yat-sen's book in 1922, they've
Right.
literally followed it by the letter with regards to Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and their attempts at Arunachal and all that stuff. How do you see this whole philosophy, which has been written by Chinese scholars, being implemented by starting from people like Mao and his little red book?
Okay. So I mean, let's just broadly understand when China is dealing with foreign countries. Say, for example, in 1861 it started, right? Something
Hmm.
analogous to foreign ministry and all of that. to deal with Western incursions that were happening at that point of time. But after the establishment of the PRC, as you're talking about Mao, and we just jump to that only, it is widely acknowledged that foreign policy decisions were concentrated in the hands of few individuals. You're rightly pointing out Mao's Red Book, right? Mao and Zhou Enlai. So Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai became the two uh, figures, but Mao became the cult figure, the cult personality, who was really designing everything. You know, he was designing how internally it should function, and he was also designing how externally he has to engage with others or not engage with others. Actually, so with the overall control of Mao and Zhou in the post-liberation, as they say, that is, post-liberation is basically after 1947, 49. The foreign policy was like a creation, orientation, direction, everything of these two leaders, perceived as the world around. And they wanted to pursue certain goals for power consolidation. Okay. The ideological inclination, as you're talking about this Red Book of Mao, was based on something we call it as Marxism and Leninist thought. So Marxist Leninist vision of the world, and then he culminated into that, and he brought this socialism, the notion of socialism, and established a communist rule to counter what he termed as the countering of imperialist forces. So he was looking at at China as a country which has been humiliated, exploited, and engaged in wars by these imperialist powers. Okay, and he wanted to overthrow them and control a different kind of civilization and a power, right? And uh, and so he wanted these linkages which existed even in Sun Yat-sen times, as you're pointing out. There were certain linkages with the imperialist forces, and he wanted to overthrow all of that. He wanted to create something like an idealist socialist China, or socialist society, as we call it as. So Mao even, crafted a very clear distinction between what constitutes inside and what was outside, and a clear divide between, the world which exists within China, within the territories of China, and the world which exists outside the territories of China. Uh, and he wanted a closed, intervention. Sort of a non-intervention from the other world, like a sustain its own sovereignty. So in that sense, Mao pursued what everyone calls it as a closed door policy, right? He really shut down his, engagements. Literally, what was happening even during Sun Yat-sen times, he closed down that. And influenced by Marxism, Mao, superimposed on this conventional divide a structure of systemic unity between elements belonging to the traditional domestic elements and elements that were, traditionally external, right? So these linkages Mao and Zhou made actually relied on choosing the kind of world block, and this is very crucial when we want to understand China and its engagement with the world, where at, we all know that China became a communist country, so they chose a communist bloc, which they thought was a better option than the imperialist forces. And considering that they always thought that the the forces like the Britishers and the other imperialist forces, France, Portugal, everyone, they were really um uh, trying to humiliate the Chinese civilization. They were trying to, and his whole ideology, that the Red Book that you're talking about, was based on this notion. The communist ideology was based on anti-imperialism, right? And hence, China linked with Soviet Union, as we all know, and pursued something called as the three broad guidelines,
Yeah.
and namely, he called it as lean to one side, starting anew, and putting the house in order before inviting guests. So these were the three guidelines on which he based his, linkages with Soviet Union. So the basic premise of this was abrogating all unequal treaties that were there, okay, getting rid of the remains of imperialism, then rejecting the diplomatic relations of Kuomintang's period, that is the Sun Yat-sen government's,
Mm, mm.
engagements that had been established with the foreign countries. So these were main focuses of Mao, which were highlighted even in his Red Book. Another thing which he highlighted in his book was the term called as revisionism. Now, this approach was basically for an approach of Soviet Union as such, right? So China actually came under pressure to again choose between, something called as the two forces that emerged in the world. One was the Soviet Union and the other was the USA, right? And hence we see in the 1960s, actually China changed its policy to of what he had as lean to one side and adopted a posture of literally striking with two fists, with two lines opposition. And the opposition was opposing the US imperialism as well as opposing the Soviet Union. So in the 60s, you would see that, there is differences between Soviet Union and China. Okay. And there is a dissection away from the kind of communism Soviet Union was, propagating. This is where he established his own, strong ideology, and later made it to as a personality cult. And in the late 70s, in the early 70s, I mean, if you say, actually China again moved back to, to the US, and we will talk that later, and implemented a diplomatic strategy of one line of uniting with the US to contain the Soviet Union. So we see China moving from closeness to Soviet Union to not being close to any of these sides, which is the closed door policy that Mao adopted, to, again, going back to US, right? In the 70s, we know the Kissinger's, this thing. And this was all followed by what Mao propounded as the three world thesis. Okay. Three world, which he really meant was the first world was the US and the Soviet Union. Okay.
Hmm.
He looked at that as the first world. Then he looked at the second world, that is the middle world, middle ranking world, where middle ranking developed countries were linked. That was the second ring for him. That's the second world he looked into. And the third world that he looked into was the developing world, or the underdeveloped world, as it was called at that point of time, which paved a way for China joining the second and third world countries. Okay. And calling it as unity with one large area, So we had all that Panchsheel coming out,
Hmm.
we had
Hmm.
this bhai stuff, bhai kind of relationships coming out. This was how Mao actually, worked onto it. Until, what we see, the changes happened in 1972 when China actually entered the UNSC and improved its ties with US, and he began to establish relations with almost 70 countries, like literally moving away from the closed door thing. And this was the first step towards literally the opening door that we talk about,
Hmm.
uh, of how the, Tang shopping period entered. Yeah.
Ma'am, I mean, there's so many questions that come into my mind. The popular narrative about the US China, and let me just take you from that. You've kind of explained the Mao philosophy and the beginning or the birth of the Mao philosophy pretty well. Uh, but the common narrative is that the US kind of approached China to
Mm,
go against the Soviet Union. uh, there is a lot of alternative thought which talks about that the Chinese actually went to the US and kept nudging them with subtle hints, saying कि यार बात कर लेते हैं and stuff like that. There was
mm,
this whole two spy drama that happened, the two defectors from China. Then there's this whole story about how the Soviets also warned the US that listen, you don't know what you're getting into.
mm.
Where was this whole thing missed? I mean, why didn't anybody see through the fact that the Chinese had a complete plan of deceiving and literally using the US against the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so the time that we are talking about is a very complex time, right? I mean, we're talking about 70s where there was complete chaos within China. I mean, we were almost at the end of the Cultural Revolution, right? There was 10 years of Cultural Revolution from 66 to 76 that was happening. Then there was Great Famine that was happening, and there was this whole notion of tussle between the political leadership, right?
Hmm.
Where the Mao's conservatives were moving towards, the reformists, the Chinese reformists. So if we go back to the miscalculation of the US and China, I would see there are a few factors to this US engagement with China, and is marked by, of course, the Kissinger's 72 visit to China. seen as one of the breakthroughs in China-US relations, right? But in 1972, if you see, the trade volume between China and the United States was only 5 billion US dollars, right? And in 2012 or something, if you see, the trade volume between both the countries went up to 500 billion US dollars. So this is the change that happened, right? Again, in 1972, if you see, the mutual investments between China and the United States was almost zero, because, as I said, it was a closed door policy that was adopted. Uh, Again, after say 2012 or something, if you see, the mutual investments reached something around 80 billion US dollars. So 79 to 2012, 20, all of that, if you see, I mean, the personal exchanges have multiplied. You know, there were zero Chinese students in US, and now there are multiple students, right? So what I feel is the premise of this relationship between US and China is that US wanted that, that US will accept China into its multilateral forums
Mm.
like the UN and all that. And so the question comes is, when US agreed on China to engage in the global world. Now, where did it went wrong? What miscalculation happened? Why today we are at a juncture where we are talking about US and China is having rivalry, and there is this whole you know confusion between the two superpowers, which is creating tensions across the world. So I believe there are basically four main factors which are based on a lack of societal understanding, cultural understanding, and even a civilizational understanding, apart from the US not being able to decipher Chinese politics. Okay. Now, if I decode all of these factors, let me begin with these four factors by one. Okay. So the first thing that we see in US was it was backing on the huge population that China had, right? It was
Mm.
viewing that the large agrarian population that China had, it will be converted into urban population, and it will build a large middle class, right? However, what happened in China was this transition from an agrarian economy to an urban economy was a radical shift of creating a huge divide with a pyramid structure, okay, whereby very few were on the top and there was a large base that remained at the bottom, okay. And so the middle class on which the US was banking for all the political reforms and things like that, that did not expand in huge numbers on scale, I'm saying. Okay, it did expand, but it did not expand in the way it expanded in India. Okay.
Mm.
At the same time, in addition, what was followed was China was following, if you would know about Chen Yun's strategy. Okay, it was called as a bird case theory. This was for the economics. Now, what was this bird case theory was that that China will open up its economy, but in a very controlled and managed manner, and this cage will be made bigger and bigger according to the size of the bird which is inside. Now, the connotation was this cage was basically the economy, and this bird was basically the people. Okay, so Chinese leaders were using this, and especially Deng Xiaoping was using Chen Yun's strategy, whereby he was saying that we will expand this cage in a very controlled and managed manner, but it will not be out of control. So it will not be the birds, that is basically the population, would be free. So as you see in China today, even if the middle class is expanded, there are youngsters who are there, all of them work in a very controlled manner, right?
Mm.
So they're not free in terms of criticizing the CCP, they're not free in having political opinions. So the freedom is there at a very individual level for having leisure and pleasure of life, make money and all of that, but not for going overboard. So the influence has been a very restricted one. This was the first thing that the US did not expect that this will happen. They thought that if capitalism will come into China, okay, and they will move towards material life,
Mm.
obviously, what the Chinese also say, "放下筷子慢养." Basically, when you're full with your stomach, you keep your chopsticks and you start cursing your government, right? That did not happen in China. Okay, this was one thing that the US always expected. So the second thing, is the digitalization factor. Okay, I mean, in terms of the digitalization factor for which the US actually speculated that the youth will drive the political reforms. I mean, you have heard, I mean, just a decade, maybe not even a decade, like 5, 7 years back, okay, there was a whole talk about how the social, media is going to change China. Okay, the youth is very active on social media and there is a lot of criticism, this, that. But what China did, and very smartly they did, was, of course they, I mean, for this purpose US also created many scholarships for the Chinese students. So you see the flood of Chinese going to US was also that China will inculcate, sorry, US will inculcate all of these Chinese with the Chinese kind of democracy. Then they will be knowing about the media, the technologies, and they'll come back and drive that. But what happened in China was the Chinese policymakers, one of the very known person was Fang Pingxing. Fang Pingxing actually created something called as the Great Wall software, which we know as the censorship infrastructure, and even supported a parallel sites and apps that assisted the CCP policies. So, so what happened in China is what we see today. I mean, Google was not allowed to work freely. Okay, so Gmail was restricted, but we had other apps like the QQ Mail. Then, so we didn't have the Google search engine, but we had the Baidu search engine. We did not have the Twitter, but we had Sina Weibo, which is Chinese version, right? And then all of this was also controlled by the volunteers in China, the youth volunteers. So China inculcated their own youth as volunteers to search and check on whatever is posted on the social media. And we many of these call it as umao,
Hmm.
the umao volunteers, basically, because that time they were given 5 mao, basically. It's a very penny amount. So the Chinese government used to pay them that much amount for this work that they used to do. So the
Is the
name came out
same?
as,
Sorry, is the
yes,
same as the 20 cent army?
yes, 20 cent. Basically, 20 cent is in the Western chronology. In the Chinese, they call it as the umao, right? So it's basically 25 cents that you give for every tweet or social media post that you check. And so the Chinese cultivated their own youth in a different direction, right?
Hmm.
And besides, there were, the controls, like within the universities, teachers were controlling the students, and students were guided. I mean, every teacher needs to know how the psychology of a student is going towards what. So what is the inclination of the student, whether they are becoming, they're protesting certain things, they are becoming aggressive, or their psychology is towards the Western. All these is also taken care of by schools and university teachers. So within the universities and schools, this was the check and balances that they were created at. And the social level also, every community had CCP volunteers. Okay, if you know about Po Xilai's time in China, the Chongqing thing that happened, there was this whole coming back of the red boom that we call it. Red songs were there, red, all of that. That was what, by the community, there were these people who were volunteers of the CCP. Okay, and they were bringing up people to raise this thought of nationalism. Okay, so again, so the US really failed in their attempt to give up scholarships and everything to woo the youngsters, and then use this media as a channel, the technology as a channel to bring that change in China. So that never happened. The third thing I feel is the lack of understanding of the Chinese historical objectives. I mean, this is very crucial when we talk about China US understanding, or for that matter, any country understanding China. you know
Hmm.
um, Chinese have always stressed on one of the ideas that is called as China as the base and West for use. Okay, Chung Thi Shi Yung. Okay, Chung Thi means China as the base, and Shi Yung means using the West. And this is there historically. This is not nothing which came out in Mao's time or something. Okay, it was always there. This was there when we were talking about the fight against the imperialist forces, like, okay, the Opium War and all of that. So this was the foundation on which China flourished, and it was all against the West movement that we called during the Qing dynasty, anti-imperialist forces. That movement, that is where this whole thing came up. And gradually, I mean, it is also called as something called as Chinese learning as substance and Western learning for application. So Chung Shui Wei Thi and Shi Shui Wei Yu, something like that. Okay. Basically, it refers to the idea of introducing and applying advanced Western science and technology based on traditional Chinese thought, culture, and system. Okay. So we gather everything from the West, okay, whether it is science and technology, we use it according to our own thought, culture, and system. Okay, this was there in China's historical times and during the Qing dynasty, after the Qing dynasty, I would say. And if you see in the mid 19th century, with the cultural invasion of the Western countries, some intellectuals in China began to get influence from European and even American ideas as intellectuals. Okay, so in 1861, after the Second Opium War, there was a person called as Feng Kui Feng. Okay, Feng Kui Feng. He propounded something called as a notion based on Chinese ethics and teachings, supplemented the art of prosperity and strength of various countries. Okay, now which actually, in essence, what Feng was arguing was for China's self-strengthening and industrialization. Uh, it needs to be borrowing the Western technology and military systems while retaining the core Neo-Confucian principles. Okay, and so these ideas were further elaborated on by what we call as Chang Tung in 1998 in his book called as Chuan Shui Pian, which is basically traditional uh, learning as substance and new, that is the Western learning as an application, which we just mentioned. So after the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895, okay, the reformers actually proposed a new cultural concept of the integration of the China and the West, uh, diverting from the original theory of Chinese substance and Western application that we are just talking about. Okay, and there was a scholar, a very famous scholar. Most of us who do translation and everything also know about his name. His name is Yan Fu, and he asserted that the Chinese learning and Western learning both have their unique substance and application. So if one treats the Chinese and the Western separately, then they both make sense. Okay, but if one tries to merge both of them together, then they both lose their meaning. Okay, so he interpreted that into one form, and then we had other reformists who came up in China, like the Kang Youwei, Liang Qichao. All of these were reformers in 100 days movement in China, and they broke the restrictions of this Chinese substance, okay, and strived to adopt a Western political system, industrialization and capitalism. And so we see during that period, there was this tussle between Western ideology, and so you see even in Sun Yat-sen's times, you see that kind of convergence that was happening.
Hmm.
However, the Chinese philosophers like Liang Shuming and everything did not agree with Chinese substance and Western application. And so to Liang, the culture was a holistic expression of one unified underlining, human attitude. So he denied an easy blending of Chinese and Western cultures. Then we had some Chinese philosophers like and he was an opponent of the Chinese substance and Western application thing in the 1930s. And he thought this idea was quite misleading, which framed Chinese learning as in opposition to the Western learning. Okay. So by 1987, if you see, what we see is Zhang introduced the same idea of in a different sense, and he introduced something called as the cultural view of comprehensive innovation. Okay, and he proposed that the Chinese nation is the main body of building a new socialist Chinese culture, and socialism is the guiding principle of China's new culture. So this is where this whole notion that West is going to be taking over the Chinese culture could not materialize. Okay, and science and technology for him were all serving the main body, that is the Chinese nation, and they all serve socialism. So I think this understanding of Chinese philosophy and the core ideological base, in one sense, was misrepresented, misinterpreted by the Westerners, especially the US and its allies, in the hope that these exchanges and linkages will transform China and the Chinese culture. Okay, this is the third point that is there. And the last point that I want to mention is again very, very crucial, and that is also linked to its Chinese culture and philosophy, is what I feel is the US and the West had a lack of decoding Chinese philosophy. Okay. I would say that they did not understand Chinese philosophy, but they did not, apply that understanding, application of that understanding into their political engagements with China. And when I say that they lack the decoding of Chinese philosophy, is Chinese culture is mainly, we all know it's a Confucian culture, right? So Confucianism and Taoism are the two main, bodies, as we say, of Chinese culture or Chinese philosophy. So this is an historical evolution and a deep cultural characteristics of the Chinese people as we know today. And I mean, and it has extended to all of the East Asian countries we know, right? If we see that, culture, the Confucian and Taoism, uh, there are these two actually encompass, whether it is Confucianism or Taoism, they encompass one common virtue, that is run. Okay, maybe you can show your viewers this character, run, because they will understand what that means, right?
Ma'am,
And that's very
can you
interesting.
repeat that?
The
You just got.
concept
I'm sorry,
run, run.
ma'am. It got cut off. So that the 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 concept
Okay,
and
so what I'm
yeah, yeah.
saying is that in okay, so what I'm saying is in the Chinese culture, there are these two things which are very important. That is Confucianism and Taoism. We all know it's a Confucius society, right? And there is a historical evolution and deep cultural characteristic for the Chinese people with this Confucian and Taoism, right? And both of these have a common virtue, uh, which is the concept of Ren. Okay, you can show this character to your viewers. Okay, a Ren character, which is very interesting because it is a manifestation of patience. Okay, so if we talk about the Chinese philosophy, the Confucian philosophy, we talk about this concept of Ren, which actually means patience. Okay, and throughout the history of China, there have been many natural and man-made disasters with floods, famine, wars, everything. But one thing that has been constantly evoked among the Chinese people is to have a Chinese mind of Ren. Okay, like in India, where we talk about anything about Indian civilization, Hindu culture, Hindu identity, we talk about karma, right? Everyone is imbibed to think in terms of karma. So whatever we do today are going to have our impact tomorrow, right? It might come back to us, all of that notions, right? So it is imbibed into us. Similarly, for the Chinese, this run is imbibed into their minds. Okay, and they feel that this run basically, uh, this means that if a human has no ability to change or reverse a situation or alter things, they need to endure with patience till the time is conducive or you have means to act. Okay, it's not the karma theory, just understand this theory as such. So run is basically, if a human is unable, he has no ability to change something. If I cannot change something, if I cannot reverse something or alter a situation, so what I will do is I will need to endure it with patience till the time is
You have the
conducive,
chance.
you can act or you can change.
Hmm.
So this is what is run all about. Okay, and this is there in their Sun Tzu art of war. When we talk about military strategies, it is all there. It is also there in Tang Xiaoping's strategy, when it is talking about the reform policy in Tang. Tang has talked about, and I'm not talking about hiding the time and biding the time or something like that. I'm talking about the other reform policy that Tang Xiaoping talked about, which was called as the crossing the river by feeling for the stone. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, crossing the river by feeling for the stone, which is called as Mocha Shritho Poha, basically roughly meant of gradual reforms. Everyone, understood this as a gradual reform. You do not jump to reforms. You do not have drastic reforms introduced. You have, trials and things like that.
Slow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the essence was to avoid threat and confrontation until the time is right to act, which is also there in the other understandings of it. So now, if you see this run in as in Chinese character, it is very interesting that it means, if you decode that character, basically it is written as run as Tao. It's like a knife on top and a heart below. Okay, so basically what you mean to say is you have a knife in your heart. I used to teach this to my students as well. So what does this run means is you do not, act immediately, but you keep the grievance or the negative things inside you to act when there is time. Okay, so in terms of the Chinese understanding of what we call as herping, or peace and harmony and all of that, there's her is the main form, right? Her is basically peace, or we call it as harmony. Now, for the Chinese, this harmony and peace, that is her, can only be achieved through ren, that is patience, endurance. Okay, and this also means that the attainment of peace is not through violent wars, but through navigating ways to attain the objective. Okay, so most of the military experts, when they look at Sun Tzu, art of war, decoding as to win a war without fighting, Puchan Arshang, it's all about this run, which is there in Chinese mind, like we have the karma thing in our mind all the time. Now, if the US and the Western powers had decoded this run in the Chinese mind, they would have understood that the Chinese mind and Chinese philosophy is looking at something else. It is looking at this whole notion of animosity, rivalry, negation, everything kept in the heart to be broken out at a time which is convenient. Okay, so so when we are saying that now China is talking about 100 years of humiliation, why we all question why China is looking at 100 years of humiliation? It was always there. I mean, you have to
Hmm.
understand, this is the Confucian thinking. This is what is run in China. This is what is run in India. This is what is run in China. This is what is run in Japan. This is what is run in Korea. This is what is run in Indonesia.
Hello, ma'am.
Sorry, it got disconnected.
Yeah, I did. This is
Okay.
what is run, and I got disconnected.
Yeah. So this is what is run all about. Like you hide your time and bide your capabilities is also about run. Okay. The endurance. You wait for an opportune time, right? This run is also there in Tang's policies of reforms. And now, when we look at Xi Jinping, again, this run comes into play. I mean, you are enduring, you are not engaging in wars immediately. Like what happened in Taiwan. I mean, even if they were showing their skills, they were not attacking. They will not attack. Okay, they will not attack at this point of time when they know that their military capabilities are not at par with the US.
Hmm.
Okay, so I think the US miscalculated all of these four aspects which are related to Chinese culture, civilization, and society, which led to US deeper engagements with China without understanding what might happen tomorrow, you know, something
That's
like
the
that.
interesting part. They gave them military technology, they gave them this and that and
Right,
the other. And in those what 8 or 9 secret agreements that Kissinger took forward, it's something very interesting. But ma'am, these things, of course, Chinese philosophy and let me just say this to all the viewers and yourself, ma'am. I'm going to bother you about this because the way you've explained this is very interesting, and I think going forward, one must actually try and understand the Chinese philosophy behind their actions rather
right.
than uh, reading the news around somewhere and this and that. Towards the end, I'd like to ask you one simple thing, ma'am. When Mao met Kissinger and he met
Right.
Nixon, he called them Ba on their face. Now, the concept of Ba is that hegemon,
Right.
and a lot of people interpret what Deng after that said in terms of hide your strength, bide your time is actually interpreted as uh, revenge on the perpetual Ba in the world to take your rightful place in history. Now, this is a very interesting thing because the Americans interpreted Ba as the leader, and the Chinese actually meant it as a hegemon.
Right.
Uh, it's such a funny thing, like here are two world leaders. One is calling the other one a hegemon, and the other guy is saying, "Yeah, thank you," because he interprets it in a totally different fashion. So, have the
Yeah.
Chinese taken advantage of this?
See, I think, I mean, of course, language is one barrier between China and the world. But apart from the language, I think, it's the cultural notions with which the Chinese, behave and act. I mean, I have never seen a Chinese coming onto my face and telling me, you are not looking good, or you are not doing this right. Even if you see, even, the people who engage with China in terms of business, right? And if you're striking a deal with the Chinese, right? And you are saying, okay, so we have finalized the deal. Okay. And if the Chinese is not satisfied with the deal, okay, he will not outrightly come and tell you, oh, I'm not happy with this, or I don't like it. Okay. Uh, they will just say, Koi. Koi literally means okay. Okay. That is how English have been translated. So English translated as Koi is okay. We'll do it. It's done. So for a foreigner, this Koi would mean, oh, the deal is final. We have clinched the deal, right? But that's not true for the Chinese. For the Chinese, it means, okay, I have understood what you said. Now I'll go back and, what we call it as fancy, I'll rethink over it.
Figure it out.
Okay.
Okay.
Figure
Yeah.
it out. So in one sense, whether Chinese will give you a straight answer for a straight question never happens. If anybody who learns the language also, they will understand that, if I ask you, is this fine? If my audio is fine, you will definitely respond, yes, fine. Or you will say, no, it is not fine. We run in a very straight world. Chinese don't run like a straight world. They will, even if they don't like something, they say, yes, yes, it is almost, I mean, in a modest manner, right? So I think what happened between this pa and thing also, which you're talking about, is basically the cultural understanding of how the Western world decoded that, and they understood that the Chinese are really happy with what the West is doing. I don't think Mao was that simple a man. I mean,
Yeah.
we are comparing Xi Jinping to Mao all because of the assertive approach Xi Jinping is taking.
Yes.
And Mao had a personality cult of his own. Okay, a very very strong personality cult. Um, Even during Tang Shopping, like many of the people say, Tang Shopping was more benign, more flexible, and non-hegemonic. Let's start from what was the history and background of Tang Shopping. He was a military man. Okay, he was purged twice by Mao Zedong, and again he was back to Mao's, CCP party, right?
Yeah.
So this is the history of Deng Xiaoping. If he was benign, he was very nice, he was really reformist in his approach, then he would have really changed China from a political reform perspective. He did not start that. In fact, if you see 1989 that happened in China, that is the Tiananmen incident, was all during Deng Xiaoping's leadership. I mean, he may not be the president, of course,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
his supreme leadership under which this whole thing happened. And before this Tiananmen incident, also, we all know about the democracy wall movement, 1979. Okay, that also that curbing of democracy wall movement. I mean, the kind of things that happened of shopping, bottles were there, the protests, Tazza Yuepao, the whole posters were there. Tang Xiaoping really cracked down on it,
Yeah.
and he did not open up democracy and reform at that point of time. Yes, he did open reform and opening up. He is called as the father of economic reforms of China. He is the pioneer in bringing that, what you call the change in China, and placing China at a position where it stands today economically. But that is also a reinterpretation of the Marxist and Leninist thoughts. He just reintroduced it into socialism with Chinese
Yeah.
characteristics in a
Yeah.
way that suits. I mean, the word you started with, first thing was deception. It suited the taste of the people,
At the
right?
time, yes, ma'am.
Yes. So when I'm saying, when you asked about deception of the Chinese, the deception of the Chinese is basically about not being a straightforward answer or a straightforward action for a straightforward, thing. It will not be an action, a reaction to an action, immediate reaction to an action. It will never happen. You will have to wait. They will, go back, analyze things, then decode it, understand what is going right and wrong, and then come back. I mean, I would be not surprised if somebody says, why India China, talks have failed or have not progressed in the way it has progressed.
Yeah.
Very simple answer. Chinese will not decide in a
Anything.
way Indians would want to decide.
Yeah.
It will go on and on for hours and hours and hours and hours, and then after maybe 10 hours or 11 hours of discussion, they will come back to square one of the discussion. Though I've not been a part of those discussions, right? I have not been sitting on those discussions, right, directly, but I know how the Chinese deal. I mean, this is how they would have done. I mean, at times, I am sure the Indian side would have got frustrated with what is happening. We are not moving ahead. We are not making
Yeah.
any progress to what is happening with India-China talks. Not that the Indians cannot, argue and they cannot bring out all of this stuff. They can be very good analysis in China, in India. But the fact of the matter is that unless and until they have decided upon something, they will not give you an assurance and a straight answer to something. Okay, which is where you may feel that you have got something, you have you know finalized something, but that is still in the progress. It's still moving on. So it's and deception is a very simple word to put that into perspective. I would not call it as a deception by the Chinese. I would call it as a very slow move of, again, as I explained, the run. You know, they would see that, okay, you hurt my feelings, you did something wrong, or you are not giving the way I want. I'm not happy with how you want to give me. Then let's progress and let's continue with it. You know, I don't want to annoy you. I'm not going to tell you that you are bad and then move away from you. And close all the doors. So Mao's way of dealing a closed door policy is completely different from Tang's way of opening up, right? So he has opened the doors to the outside world, but in a very, very controlled manner. I mean,
Ah,
if you see the whole investment that happened in China, how many Westerners were investing in China in 70s and 80s? It was all Taiwan and Hong Kong.
yeah.
So, I mean, we have to put that into perspective to understand why it did not work with the West as they expected. I mean, you expect the political reforms to take place. Political reforms was never an agenda in CCP. It was not there when Mao was the cult. It was not there when Tang came to power. Jiang and
Yes.
Hu Jintao never progressed with that. Xi Jinping is now, I mean, people are thinking he's going back.
Backwards.
Right.
The interesting part is that the word reform, rather than being just connected with economy, it has been connected with the reform in China. Everybody kind of thought, oh, China will now become, you know, democratic and this and that. And it's a
Yes.
complete farce, I think.
No, see, when Deng Xiaoping came out with this policy in 78, late or early 79, when you talk about, and really progressed in the 80s, he talked about reform and opening up. Okay, we call
Mm.
it as reform and opening up. So reform was basically internal reforms, that is economic reforms. And I just explained you about the bird case theory. So the
Mm.
reforms were to be progressed by feeling for the stones, which is a gradual progress. And that progress is based on Chanyun's, bird case theory. So that is internal consumption thing. And opening up was for the outside world. So opening up was for Deng Xiaoping. He looked at a world which was more peaceful than the wars that were happening during World War One and World War Two. And
Mm.
so he thought that we need to engage with the Western world. I mean, that you are saying about having connections with the world. And if you see in Tang's time, and it'll be very interesting to tell you about that, is about the discourse that was happening within China in terms of the debate between conservatives and reformists during that time. You know, so there. I mean, China is not about there is no debate and there is no discussion within China. There is. I mean, within CCP also there is a discussion. It's not as democratic as we talk about. It's not as open as we talk about, but there is a discussion. And so there were these two factions which have multiplied during Hu Jintao's time, which were like Marxist, and then they became neo-Marxists, and they were reformists, and then they came up to neo-reformists and all. But during Tang's time there were these two broad fractions of conservatives who were pro-Mao, and the other one, the reformists, who were going with the trend of Deng Xiaoping. We were like flowing with the river. you know so they wanted the reforms should be brought into China, and China should really open up to the outside world. Now when they said open up to the outside world, they did not say invite foreign investment, and let the let China be run by the foreigners. So there were not many joint ventures in China at that point of time. Even, I mean, I'm saying even not joint ventures. Forget about fully, foreign funded companies. And the conservatives were really looking at the approach of what we call as, not opening to the outside world. Basically, letting it be the closed door policy of what Mao did. And then there were the realists who believed in emphasizing on what we call as national power to achieve China's long-term goals. So while these reformists or the liberals, as we advocated, participation in international institutions. Okay, so this was collided by an approach we call it as a constructivist approach that advocated China's peaceful rise. And the main component of this was that identity factor. I
Mm.
mean, you keep the identity factor into play, have the Chinese philosophy of I Ching, that is, I Ching is basically the change. Nothing is stable in the world. The behavior and interest of every actor in the in the international system will change. Okay, so that is what is I Ching all about. It's basically from Chinese philosophy again. So they were really looking at that. And realists believe that, so that there is no major power which can rise peacefully, but only through violence. While these liberals and the reformists and also the constructivists, which we call it as, they advocated the argument that for something as pro-peaceful rise of China through some tangible benefits which China can gain. And they thought that, I mean, there's one very interesting scholar in China called as Liang Shenping. He's basically from Hong Kong. Uh, he did many of these talks about decoding Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policy. Okay. And he said, Deng Xiaoping was not looking at a China, which is a socialist China, which will remain poor. So he decoded and he said, at that point of time, when we were talking about reforms in China, we were looking at China, which was devastated by the 10 years of cultural revolution, devastated by the famines. Economy was very, bad, in a bad state. So we were looking at a China which is not poor for everyone. So poverty is not the thing that we were looking for everyone. What we wanted was to, if you've heard this phrase of Deng Xiaoping, like catch the mice, whether it is black or white, right?
Black or white.
So no matter it is a black mice or a white mice, the black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches the mice, it's a good cat. So this whole notion is interpreted and reinterpreted in China many a times with the thought that, saying that Liang Shenping is saying that one way is looking at money as a factor. You make money as you want, so the means is not important. The end is important. So you can have illegal means to make money, right? The other thing which Liang Shenping is looking at is that Deng Xiaoping was not talking about poverty for everyone. So socialism is not about being poor. Okay. Socialism is a path of moving from poverty to prosperity in a transitional phase. So if you see any of the Chinese philosophies or the speeches of Xi Jinping or Hu Jintao, everyone, they're just talking about this whole transitional phase of China towards prosperity, and that has come from Deng Xiaoping. So in that sense, I feel that Deng Xiaoping was not looking at China in a very, I mean, he was opening up in a fashion that would give material benefits to China,
Yes.
bring prosperity to China, but will be in control of Chinese politicians and the CCP. And so gun rules the barrel and all of that stories that we know about party controlling the military, party controlling the people, party controlling, the human life,
Everything.
all is there. Everything is there.
I must say, ma'am, this was a story. You've told us such a beautiful story, and it goes in a flow. I've been personally very interested in China, and by doing these podcasts, what I'm trying to do is get more people interested in the philosophy of China. Don't listen to the news about China; it doesn't make sense. What makes sense is how they think, and that's something that you've brought out very, very carefully.
Thank you.
ma'am.
But I think I also, I have been advocating for Indians to look at China from Indian perspective rather than looking from the Western lens.
Yeah,
West has its own agenda and its own interest to understand China. We have civilizational linkages. I mean, Buddhism is one linkage, right? I mean, look at how China adopted Buddhism and created its own way of Buddhism.
yeah,
I mean, we want to reclaim it, but I mean, in one sense, they are promoting now Tibetan Buddhism as Chinese Buddhism. I would
mm,
not be surprised if tomorrow we'll have Tibetan Buddhism also. So, in one sense, I would feel that Indians need to understand China, and it's a very fascinating country anyway. I mean, the history, the philosophy, the culture, the civilization, the ideologies which CCP has promoted, and the continuum of these leaders and their philosophies. Or whether it's socialism or socialism with Chinese characteristics or socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era, all of that has a very deep meaning and very good for anybody who wants to understand China. Very complex also. I mean, these short podcasts are not enough, but you will have
yeah,
to continuously engage with China to understand China. And your channel, in one sense, is doing a great job, I must say.
ma'am. Thank you so much. Coming from you, it's such a pleasure to hear something like that. Ma'am, parting thought before
Yeah.
the next podcast, before the next time I disturb you, what should the viewers read before they come and sit in front of you again? Just a short
Uh,
note or a short poem or something, or probably the 36 stratagems or whatever you'd like to put across. Give us a little homework so that we can go back, read a little bit, understand this thing, and come back and listen to you again.
I think there's so many factors that I work. I mean, I have worked a lot about Chinese society. I have lived with them. I have, traveled across China, and understanding Chinese society itself is one fascinating thing for me. And now, when the changes are happening, when India is also growing, economically it is growing. Its population is larger than Chinese population. The challenges are going to be unique for India, I'm sure, but there would be experiences from the Chinese. So I think those factors about how economy and society is reshaping in China would be one of the interesting things which I now love to look at. But I mean, your viewers can choose about anything that they love to read and listen to. Yeah,
Thank you so much, ma'am. It's always, as I said, a learning experience. To listen to. For me, it's a very interesting thing because I'm reading these books about the philosophy of China. I told you about them, and I'm trying to figure out some other stuff which will tell me, the back end of these 36 stratagems that they talk about.
right.
The China Dream by Colonel Ling Ming Fu. Of course, that's
Mm,
not a very easy read. It's a very difficult read. I've read it three times till now. I mean, I literally read each page three times because it's just some of it is very easy. It's easy to understand, but some of it takes you in a very different tangent.
mm,
Uh, but when for personally for me, these podcasts are a little bit of a, I would say, an additional spice in the entire dish, which really brings about the flavor. Because when I read those and when I hear this, it tells me somewhat of a story within China. My message is very simple. China is not the news. China is not Xi Jinping. China is a whole lot more than that. So
right,
it's not Pakistan where they will come out and say what they're thinking. It is China who will never say what they're thinking. And you have
right,
to interpret what they are thinking and then counteract. And only if you're able to get above them or disturb their Xi, as they call it, will they respect
right,
you. Ma'am, thank
right.
you so much for this wonderful talk. Looking forward for another one, educative talk in very short time. Till then, ma'am, Jai Hind.
Okay, namaste, Jai Hind to your viewers.